Hey there, I'm Joel Jamieson of 8weeksout.com and Bioforce HRV. And in this video, we're going to expand upon what we talked about in the last video in the fundamentals of energy systems and talk more about how the aerobic and the anaerobic systems relate to conditioning and ultimately to performance. But first, let's do a quick review of what we talked about in the last video. First, we talked about the fact that energy systems are responsible for keeping every cell in the body alive and functioning. That's always the first and foremost things that energy systems are designed and are going to do. Next, we talked about the fact that the rate of energy production is inherently and always inversely related to its duration, meaning the faster your body has to produce energy, the less duration it's going to be able to do it for. Finally, we talked about the body uses both the aerobic and the anaerobic systems, and the way that it uses those two systems is going to depend specifically on the environment that you place it in. Now, today we're going to talk more about what that means, and let's start by looking at this energy systems graph. And basically what this graph does is show you the different energy system contributions between the aerobic and the anaerobic over different distances of sprinting. Now you can see on the far left there that's a very short sprint, and as indicated by the red, you see it's a very high anaerobic event. It's a 200 meter, it's very, very short event compared to the longer events, and you can see a very high anaerobic contribution. Now the stunning thing to look at here, the most important thing to look at is the longer you go, and you can see as the duration of the sprinting events increase, the anaerobic side decreases dramatically, and you can see the aerobic side increases to take its place. So basically what we can see is that very short events, 20, 30, 40 seconds, can be highly anaerobic. But as soon as you start putting the body in an environment where it's much longer than that, we see that the aerobic system ultimately takes over the majority of the energy production. And typically most research shows that occurs somewhere between 50 and 60 seconds roughly, depending on the event. But any point after 50 to 60 seconds of continuous work, that environment is going to become predominantly aerobic. So any event that's 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, even though it might seem short and it might seem fast, there's simply no way the body can produce that much energy anaerobically, and the reality is that the aerobic system is producing the majority of it. Now, it doesn't mean the anaerobic system is not producing a lot or it's not important. It's important to understand that any duration above about a minute is going to be a predominantly aerobic event in nature. And we can look at this similar type situation when we repeat sprints, because you might say, well, my event isn't 200 meter sprint or 400 meter sprint, it's intermittent. So many sports, almost every sport is intermittent in nature, and lots of other activities are intermittent. So this is a study where they looked at basically a 30-second maximum sprint followed by a 40-second rest or 4-minute rest, and then another 30-second maximal sprint. And now the interesting thing to see is that from sprint 1 to sprint 2, again, they rested for 4 full minutes. The percentage of aerobic contribution went up dramatically, which you can see there in the green. So that very first sprint was quite a bit anaerobic. But as you had the people in the study had to repeat it, it became much more aerobic because the anaerobic glycolytic component, which is part of the anaerobic energy system, contributed much less, and the aerobic system went up to 44%. So what that shows us is that the more you repeat something explosively, the more aerobic it becomes. And it's a simple explanation. We can see that as you repeat something over and over again, you're going to do it slower than if you only had to do it once. And the reason you're doing it slower is because the body has to rely more and more on aerobic because it can't sustain the anaerobic system over and over and over again. The body is designed to fatigue and bring the aerobic system into play and produce more through the aerobic pathways because that one is sustainable versus the anaerobic system, which isn't. Now we can wrap this up and put us in a great package by understanding a concept called the anaerobic power reserve. And if you understand this fundamental concept, you'll understand how energy systems really work and how they relate to performance. Now what the researchers did that coined the term the anaerobic power reserve is they had athletes essentially produce as much force, as much speed, as much power, and they actually measured this in speed through aerobic means. So basically they looked at their speed at VO2 max, which is they basically found out how fast can these athletes run on pure aerobic energy. They took that speed and then they had them sprint as fast as possible, which we know very short sprint is predominantly anaerobic, and they took that speed. So as you can see there, the total bar there is showing us the maximum speed they could reach with anaerobic speed, and the black bar there is showing us the speed they were able to reach with aerobic speed. And they coined the difference the anaerobic power reserve. And what it simply shows us is that the body is always going to produce as much of the force, much of the power, as much of the work it can aerobically, and then whatever it can't produce through aerobic means, it's going to make up the difference anaerobically. So if you want to think about a jet or a car, the body is always producing as much as it can aerobically, and then the anaerobic is like the afterburner. It's going to kick in whatever it has to, but the body's first and foremost always going to produce it as much as possible aerobically, and only then will make up the difference anaerobically, which is much different than most people think. They tend to think that the anaerobic side kicks in first and then the aerobic system takes over later. It's not necessarily the case. The body's always working aerobically, and it will produce as much as it can. Whatever you ask beyond that, that's where it kicks in anaerobically. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because what the researchers found in this study is that the greater the anaerobic power reserve, which basically tells us the more total energy you're producing anaerobically, the faster you fatigue. Now you can see there in the athletes and the people studying the far left, they had much bigger anaerobic power reserves. They were able to run much faster than the athletes on the far right. But they also fatigued faster than the athletes on the right because a greater percentage of their energy was coming from the anaerobic side. So if we just want to look at this from a practical standpoint, let's say we had two athletes, athlete A and athlete B. And again, if you look at this bar chart here, the blue represents the aerobic contribution, the red represents the anaerobic contribution. If both of these athletes are asked to produce 600 watts, which athlete do you think is going to be able to maintain that power output for longer? Clearly, it's going to be athlete B, because a greater percentage of that 600 watts is going to come from the aerobic side, which is sustainable. In athlete's A case, they're having to produce much more of it anaerobically, so they're going to fatigue a lot faster. And that's really, really important to understand that whatever power output you're delivering or you have to develop, the higher the percentage of it comes from anaerobic, the faster you fatigue. That's what the anaerobic power reserve and the research that was used to develop it show us. Now, you might think, well, okay, great. This just means that as long as I have a higher anaerobic power reserve, or sorry, a lower anaerobic power reserve, if I produce more of it aerobically, I'm always going to have the best conditioning, and I'm always going to outlast my competition, or I'm going to always perform better. Well, it's not that simple. What it tells us also is that it's not just how much energy you can produce, we talked about earlier, it's how much and how well you decide to expend that energy. So you can go above different levels of energy production, but you're going to do that at the expense of how long you can maintain it. So if we look at this graph, which shows us power output over time, we have athlete A and athlete B again here. Let's say athlete A is capable of producing much higher levels of power than athlete B. Well, you think, okay, this athlete can produce more power, they're going to last longer, they're going to do better, they're going to outperform athlete B, but it depends on how well they decide to manage that energy. So if we look at this graph, those little lines represent how much energy they're actually spending. If athlete A spends a whole bunch of time above the maximum level they can sustain, they're going to fatigue a lot faster. If athlete B stays a lot closer to his or her maximum power output, they're going to be able to maintain that over a greater period of time. And if we look at the graph, by the end of the graph, their power, at the end of the time period, their power output could be the exact same, or athlete B ultimately could be producing more power than athlete A, simply because athlete A chose to not stay within their range. So again, conditioning and energy systems come down to how much energy you can produce, how much of that energy comes from the aerobic versus the anaerobic, and then it comes down to how well you decide to manage your energy expenditure and how well you decide to expend the aerobic, the anaerobic energy you're producing. So just to give a quick summary, the trade-off between the rate and the duration of an activity is directly related to basically the contributions between the aerobic and the anaerobic. The greater percentage of anaerobic, the less duration you're able to sustain anything for. So the more something is aerobic, the longer you can sustain it for. It's that simple. And conditioning ultimately depends on how your body produces that energy, how much of it comes from the aerobic, how much of it comes from the anaerobic, and of course how you choose to expend that energy. And that's really what conditioning comes down to, and how energy systems are so closely related to it. All right, so that wraps up this video. In the next couple of videos, we're going to talk more specifically about aerobic training and anaerobic training and the basic principles you need to understand to get the most out of your program. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you again in the next video.